human perspective.
All right, welcome to Unbiased and on the Fence. I'm Shane. Thank you guys so much for joining. Let me make sure everybody's unmuted. Of course, this is Paranormal Frequencies, and we have Todd Acamesis with us. How are you doing, Todd?
I'm doing really good. It's very early hours here in the United Kingdom. I think it's about 4 a.m., but I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready to go.
Well, I appreciate you accommodating our time differences or whatever. But it's a real pleasure to have you on, man, because, I was so inspired by watching some of your Synchronicity Walks way back in the day and everything. But before we jump to that, let's Sherry introduce you to the audience, just in case people haven't heard of you.
Okay. Todd is a self-taught astral traveler and a near-death experience researcher. He's been exploring consciousness through altered states and expanded states of awareness for more than 2 decades. After journeying and exploring the afterlife environments of the spirit world during more than 800 conscious out-of-body experiences, Todd shares what he's learned about life after death through talks and workshops. More recently, he's co-developed the PandoraStar Deep Trance Light Machine System, a powerful flickering light device that entrains the brain to specific brainwave frequencies for the purpose of triggering exotic states of consciousness. I'm lost. Such as lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences. Todd also regularly leads synchronicity walks through the United Kingdom to guide people in experiencing the raw nature of synchronicity. He's developed a special card deck for people who experience synchronicity in their everyday lives. Todd, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Sherry. It's my pleasure to be here.
So can you start by telling us okay, I do know that you had a near-death experience as a child when you were 5. Maybe you could start there. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, sure. So used to go to a landfill as a family outing, believe it or not. I guess it wasn't really considered that way by my father, but he was a builder. He had his own construction company, and we just go with him on weekends to a landfill where he had the people who operate it were really good friends of his. And it was an old fishery, so lots of fish ponds. And we all used to, me and my 3 brothers, we just wander around, and sometimes, I just sort of go off on my own. And one of the fish ponds just got, really close. I remember standing on the edge and looking down at my reflection, and something just really seemed to catch my eye, and leaned over a little bit too far, fell in, went under the water. And within a very short period of time, everything just seemed to be really serene, and there was a bright flash of light, and suddenly I was dry as a bone standing somewhere else. And it was one of these things where it just I didn't seem to have any concerns. I just didn't seem to, to even give it a second thought that I'd just fallen into the water. So I was now in this completely different place, and I remember there being a really large tree, and as a boy, I really loved climbing trees, so my first instinct was to climb this tree. So I climbed up the tree, and there were a bunch of people that started gathering at the bottom of the tree. And then I heard a voice coming from higher up the tree, and I looked up, and there was a man further up, and he called my name, And he said something so along the effects of, you're not meant to be here. And I looked down at the people again underneath the tree that were gathered, and they didn't seem very friendly. And so I thought he meant, you're not supposed to be in this tree. And there must have been some sort of telepathic connection, because he was definitely reading my mind. It's not something he couldn't see my facial expression as such. And, so it must have been. And knowing what out of body experiences are like as an adult, it's all about telepathic experience. When you're out of body, it's telepathic communication. So it's not something I knew as a child, though. When I was growing up back in the 1970s, out of body experiences were not a common topic. There weren't any popular books on the subject. So, it's just not the languaging that I'd use back then. Nevertheless, being in the tree, I was in the tree. The man was definitely reading my thoughts, and he kind of chuckled and he was like, "Oh, no, I don't mean, in the tree." And he said something along the lines of, "Yes, it's probably a sacred tree to these people, and we probably shouldn't be in their tree, but I mean, you shouldn't be here." And then suddenly my mind was really crystal clear. And I had a feeling that he was actually doing it. And suddenly I remembered that I was 5 years old and I'd fallen into a fish pond. And he said, "Wait here, I'm going to get you some help."
Wow.
And just within seconds of him saying that, I was now being pulled out of the pond and resuscitated. So I have a strong feeling to this very day that, the nudges that we sometimes receive, like synchronicity as an example, we could maybe just be wandering around town and suddenly we get an urge to go left instead of right. And then something significant happens. I think the same thing happened on that particular day. I think whoever it was that pulled me out of that pond, they got a strong nudge to go one direction instead of another, because it just wasn't my time to go. So, I think this kind of stuff, is powerful. And for me, it was a really early education on multidimensional reality. Soon after that, I started having spontaneous out-of-body experiences that would happen on a very regular, almost nightly basis.
Wow. So did you have to on those when you were young and having these out-of-body experiences and everything, did you go through all the things of having to face certain fears and things like that? Or were all of your experiences positive in the beginning?
No, a lot of them, there's a thing called a fear test. And I think fear tests take place throughout our lives at every stage. And I certainly had my fair share of experiences where I remember the very first lucid dream that took place 2 months after that near-death experience. And again, I didn't know what a lucid dream was either. That wasn't a popular subject either. I actually created my own labels when I was a child. The label, I had Sleepy House and Wakey House. Wakey House was when I figured I was awake in what we'd call physical reality. And Sleepy House was when I was awake when I was asleep, if that makes any sense. So that was just my sort of ways of trying to get a handle on what was taking place. So whenever I was having an out-of-body experience, adult label, my childhood label was Sleepy House. So I'd suddenly wake up, for example, maybe standing in the middle of my bedroom, and I could see my physical body lying on the bed. And I came to recognize that as this phenomena that I would label Sleepy House. It was a replica of my physical house, and there was certainly dreamlike aspects to it. But most of the time, it was a high fidelity copy of my house. And yeah, for sure, sometimes I would come out of body and strange things would happen, things that would bring about fear. And I had 2 guides from a very early age. Again, these not something I would label spirit guides. because again, those are labels. That's the kind of label that came later on in life as well. But I had these two human people who would come to me on a regular basis. And, I nicknamed them the Tweedle Twins because they were like Tweedledee and Tweedledum in my mind. They were very similar. Their mannerisms, the way that they dressed, everything about them just reminded me of these Disney characters, if I'm not mistaken. And they'd show up, and there would be lessons, there would be some education, and part of it was these fear tests. So maybe initially it was when I was the lucid dream that I brought up. I remember I was in a dream, and in the moment it was unconscious, and I think even in all dreams, there's a part of us that is always aware that we're dreaming, but it's usually not the analytical part, the logical reasoning. So in this dream, I was with my younger brother, who was probably 4 years old, and we were standing in some tall grass, this very grassy field, and suddenly this tiger just lunged out of nowhere, and my brother sort of ran one direction, I ran the other direction, and the tiger decided to chase after my brother. And this kind of gave me mixed feelings. Part of it, one feeling was like relief. The other feeling was, a concern for my brother. And in that moment, there was like a voice, or two voices actually. And I'm sure it was the Tweedle Twins. There were these voices that pierced the unconscious part of the dream, and said something to the effect of, that tiger doesn't look very real from where we're standing. And it just woke me up in the dream itself. I remember suddenly having this electric rush of energy running through me. And I was aware, I actually remember thinking in my head, this has to be a dream, because I went to bed just earlier, and there's no tigers in Tampa, Florida. Tampa, Florida is where I grew up. I was like, there's no tigers except for the zoo or Busch Gardens. And so I realized it must be a dream. And in that moment, I suddenly, the fear that I was feeling just moments before, I suddenly felt really empowered. Right. I felt like I had a level of control over the dream. And I rushed after the tiger that was chasing down my younger brother. And the moment I caught up to it, the moment I touched it with my hand, it suddenly shrank to the size of a little kitten. And it turned around and it started to purr at me. So I guess that was me passing, one of these very early fear tests that I experienced during these childhood out-of-body experiences. And I think the fear tests, they're not to test us to see if we're going to fail. I think they're testing us to see if we're ready to progress in our journey, because we always have things like our integrity to work on, or maybe there's character flaws that our guides, our helpers are looking for us to work on. So some sort of growth, and in a lot of cases, maybe we don't know that we have certain fears, an unconscious fear, an unrecognized fear. And these are usually the fears that stop us from going further. They're the blocks to exploration. They're the boundary points of our comfort zones. And I think when we start to realize that ultimately, when we confront these fears, and this is everyday fear, these are fears of not being seen, fears of am I enough? They don't have to be some grandiose idea. They're literally the everyday fears that we all face, throughout our lives. And I think when we learn that we don't always have to be paralyzed by the fear, that we can actually take loving actions to transcend the fear, we start to grow. So I was very grateful as a child to experience, this double life in dreamland as well as the out-of-body state, because I felt it really helped me really helped me understand more who I was, and it really helped me understand my waking life and helped me deal with things, which was great because if you can imagine, as a child who is now having these multidimensional experiences, it's not normal. And the moment I started informing friends of these experiences, then you'd start picking up the kind of labels like, the weird kid. But it was an interesting start to life.
I know. One time I was having like an out of body experience or lucid dream and like flying over the forest. I was headed to the Monroe Institute or something. I was over this forest, and anyway, there was this. It was like a devil type creature. All of a sudden, slams me down on my back, and it's right there. And I've had things like that happen before that woke me up, or I'd be terrified. And this time, I told him some stuff like to get, leave me alone and all this. And then all of a sudden there was multiple people around me that were like clapping, including him, and telling me, "Oh, she's fine. She finally got it," and all this. So I really resonate with what you're saying there. That's now, with the, would you agree with me, what I've learned, or you can explain, like, I don't think that there's really a difference in lucid dreaming and out of body experience, except for the fact of maybe how much awareness you're bringing into the experience is, or what do you think?
I have, from personal experience, I think they are they seem to be two distinct states. Although I would say that, from my perspective nowadays, all of reality and every reality that we enter, whether a dream or an out of body experience, I think they're all mental in nature, including our waking life. I think some out of body researchers would say, we're living in virtual realities, and I think things like lucid dreams, for sure, certainly are good evidence that this could be the case. So ultimately, it's all mental reality. But I think with the lucid dream, it's like a bubble within a bubble. It's a very personal space, what you would call a non-consensus environment, where it's you and your dreaming mind. Whereas the out-of-body state, you've entered a larger reality, a shared reality, a consensus reality. And I have, from experience, had lucid dreams where dream characters have a sense, there's a sense of autonomy with some of the characters, or the other beings definitely are able to enter the dream space. There's no doubting that. But I do think, on a whole, I think they're distinct states in the sense that one is typically a private world, which can, where you can invite other beings in, and other beings can enter, I think, through the permission of other levels of yourself. But I do find that the out of body state and lucid dreams, they're kind of like, here I am in my home right now in a big city, like which is London. And at the moment, I'm in a bubble. I'm in a bubble of my own making, in a sense. But once I walk out that door, I'm now in the bubble of London. But yet my dream bubble is within that bigger bubble. So I think they're sharing the same space in a sense. They're not separated by space. They're just separated by vibration. And that's kind of how I see the lucid dream and the out of body state. But like I usually tell my students, who I teach lucid dreaming and out of body experiences, I don't think it's necessarily important in the early stages to understand the differences between these states. I find what's important in the beginning is becoming as lucid and conscious as you can, because then you actually get to do more stuff. It's just like in waking life. The more animated that you are, the more lucid you are in everyday life, then the in-body experience becomes far more profound with each moment of presence. So I find exactly the same in these altered states. The more present we can become within the lucid dream, the more present we can become within the out-of-body experience, there's so much more for us to experience.
One thing, I'm Sorry, Shane, you have anything to say? I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. Do you find that your experience within the different realms, if you will, makes you view what we would typically think of where we're at right now, base reality, if you will, as being more, I don't know, malleable or I don't know. I don't even know. We didn't even discuss. I don't know if you even heard of the Mandela effect or your thoughts on that or whatever. But there seems to be this, the reality seems to be not set in stone as we're typically, what current physics would teach us, and it seems like very orchestrated, almost impossible things like you see on your synchronicity walks, and then it's like the more you seem to pay attention to these sorts of synchronicities, the more you see. It's like you can't really disprove it because it's like you open this floodgate and you start noticing all of these things, and your reality seems to be almost just like orchestrated. Like if you're playing a video game and you come across something in it, you don't, you never think, how did that just come about, on accident or whatever. They had to program it to be there, even if it's like when you guys were looking in the dumpster, there's that little piece of paper with this message on it, and on your synchronicity walk, and it was like everything seems so orchestrated on a level that's just you can't even wrap your head around.
Yeah, indeed. And the word orchestrated is very good because I have to remind people, and I sometimes say this on camera when we're wandering around, that these walks, although there seems to be there is a high level of organization, but it's never orchestrated in a sense consciously on our part. But I do believe that yes, that reality on this level, because it is a subset of a much bigger environment, I do feel that this environment is projected from a higher realm, to use the word you used earlier, and a higher physics is involved. And I think when we invoke the law of synchronicity, we're invoking this ordering effect on reality. And I think that personal causality is very powerful when we set our intention, and through that intention we're basically we're saying, okay, this is what I'd like to experience, this is what I'd like to create. And then by trusting that we can start to navigate, and the inner navigator will guide us in exactly the right direction. Before we went live, I remember, Shane, you mentioned, it's like sat nav, like GPS, and it's exactly like that in my mind when we're on these synchronicity walks. In the very beginning, when we set our intention, we're programming the car's GPS for a particular journey. And let's say during the synchronicity walk, where we're wandering around London, or it could be anywhere, and if there is something that we're meant to experience, if there's a universal gamer who has programmed a particular set of experiences, and if there are things that we're meant to uncover in the body of the game or the synchronicity walk, and let's say, for example, we're meant to go left, but we go right through self-fate, because we can be self-determined, I think, in the sense that, we do have free will. This is something that I firmly believe from my experiences. So let's say that, we have self-fate, where we go against the fate set by, the universal gamer. But the universal gamer really desires for us to experience this, particular thing that has been programmed. Then, just like with the GPS in the car, if we're meant to go left and we miss that turn, then it will just recalibrate. The actual device will recalibrate the journey, and it'll then give you the next set of instructions to go left. And I often feel that on these synchronicity walks, and I find that the more sensitive that you become to energy, the more sensitive you're becoming, to being nudged by, this universal gamer, this creator. which ultimately I think is us. Because I find that when I'm out of body, I sometimes meet parallel versions of myself. I'm meeting advanced versions of myself. And it's this interconnected web of not just me and these other versions of me, but all of us. And I think all combined, we have this very elaborate universal consciousness, which, is directing, inspiring, creating chances and opportunities. So on these walks, if we're meant to go left, then, we'll recalibrate and we'll find what we're meant to experience, because I think we are meant to find meaning in life. And these experiences of synchronicity, certainly give us that opportunity, because, the difference between something like coincidence and synchronicity is exactly just that. It's one experience is meaningful. And we often find on these walks that you would think that, yes, it is orchestrated. Sometimes people say to me, are you sure you didn't plant actors, throughout the walk, and they're just playing roles? Like, I'll give you one example. I don't know if I've mentioned before on any of the podcasts or episodes of my YouTube channel, but we were just started the walk in London, and I'd said to everybody, it's learning to follow your gut instincts, learning to follow your first instinct, because sometimes we doubt ourselves. And when we doubt ourselves, this is where we start to experience, fear of being lost, fear of being alone, fear of not being enough, all these kind of manifestations of fear. And I said, so if the dice, that we use, so we roll the dice, and if the dice does go left, then go left. Or if you get an instinct to suddenly go right, then go right. So we started the walk, and we rolled the dice, and the dice asked us to go straight. And I always say to people, when we're on these walks, one of the guidelines is to sort of flow like the consciousness of water. Just flow with what is. So I said, so one of the guidelines is every time we come to an intersection where there's more than one direction to go, we'll stop. And instead of going with our control system, that part of us, the ego, that part that wants to control the experience, we roll the dice again at the intersection, and the dice will keep deciding which direction that we go. So we came to a very small intersection. We had the main road, and then we had an alleyway. And so this was right in the center of London. And I knew that alleyway well, because I'd been down it once before on a synchronicity walk, as well as several times just on my own. And I knew that it would just lead into some residential buildings within, the bigger city area, the commercial area. So I had this, suddenly had that part of my own personal control system, the ego, which wanted to ignore my own advice about recalibrating in that moment, rolling the dice, because it was an intersection, because I already knew where that road led, or at least I thought I did. So as I was walking by the alleyway and sort of ignoring it, somebody pointed out there was a sign on a shop opposite on the other side of the road, directly adjacent to the alleyway, that said something along, the lines of follow your heart. And I took that as a sign that I was ignoring my own advice and that I was controlling the walk. And I very rarely would do anything like that. So we came back to the intersection, we rolled the dice, and the dice directed us down the alleyway. So these are one of those moments where you have to laugh, because it's like the trickster aspect to life, the trickster aspect to synchronicity. If you don't laugh, then what else are you going to do? You're going to take yourself too seriously. So I laughed. We went down the alleyway. And when we got into the alleyway, the first row of houses that we came across, on one of the doors, and I do believe the door actually the house number was the same number that we'd rolled at the very beginning of the walk, the first number that the first dice roll, and that itself was a nice little, you could say, coincidence at the moment. But on the door, there was a note that said, "Doorbell not working, so just knock." And I took that as a personal sort of nudge that, I was meant to knock on the door. So as everyone gathered around, I said, okay, well, why don't we let the dice decide whether we should knock or not? So I rolled the dice, and the answer was no. And I like to tempt fate. I think it's one of those things where when we tempt fate on these synchronicity walks, anything can happen. Right. So I thought, okay, maybe this is just a test. Reminding me that I have free will, and that if I want to go against what the dice says, then I can tempt fate. So I said to the group, I'm going to knock on the door. And my hand barely touched the door to rap on the door when the door opened. And the woman who owned the house, she just started laughing. And she apparently had overheard everything that I'd said to the group, standing right in front of her door. And she was quite fascinated that, we were there. And I explained to her a little bit of the mechanics of the synchronicity walk, that we roll the dice. Sometimes we roll the dice and there's one of the facets of the dice that says, follow the white rabbit. So I was telling her that in particular. I said, we've been following white rabbits the whole night. We rolled the dice. And when I said, follow the white rabbit, it caught her something, you could see there was something there. And she had this look. And she said, I actually have a live white rabbit for a pet running around my house right now. And everybody was absolutely bowled over, because not only was my personal control mechanism wanting us to ignore that side street, that alleyway that I knew so well, or that I thought I knew so well. We had a sign that directed us back, and then we had the on the door was one of the first, was the number of the house, was our first dice roll. So all of these things, it's like a breadcrumb trail. Mm-hmm. So I do think, to answer your question, with a very long sort of a circuitous route, I do think, that there are certain things that we are meant to experience in life. And I think some of these things are probably engineered before we even come into this life. I think things that are linked to our karma, whether it's what you could call negative or positive karma, because there's all levels to this. I think a lot of times when people think of karma, it's usually they're thinking about it in a bad way. But, karma, we have I think the universe keeps a perfect set of books. And, we don't just do, things that lead to having a karmic debt, but we do things that lead to having an actual positive balance on those books.
Exactly.
Yeah, really cool. I noticed too, though, with synchronicity, though, that there's both there's love or fear, and I've just found in my life that I've always kind of like followed synchronicity, and if you are scared in following it, you're going to still have things even in the physical manifest. It'll just keep, the more you focus, the worse it gets. Right? I've just learned that it's best to flow in a positive way and just, I guess, like they say, follow your bliss.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
I can see people getting freaked out by some of that stuff, though. You know what I mean? Because it is. I mean, you could totally look at it in a fearful way and be like, why is all this happening? And freaking out about it, too. I mean, it's just like really what you create out of it, because it is something very metaphysical or paranormal happening when you really begin to notice it. And, I think it's a cool thing, though. It makes life so fun and entertaining to realize that it's so interactive in a way that it's not so just random,
For sure. And I think, it is magical, and that magic does scare some people. I mean, it's scared me at, certain times in my life, to realize that, reality can be so thought responsive. And I think this is why we do need to watch our thoughts and be mindful of our feelings, because as per reality creation 101 or the law of attraction 101 principle, whether we focus on something positive or negative, it will grow. And thankfully, for most of us, we're maybe not, we're still apprentices when it comes to manifestation. We're still learning, we're still students, and we have a feedback loop. So there's a period of time, it seems for a lot of us, before things will manifest. And that could be very beneficial, because if we're in a negative state of mind, it's a good thing that things don't come about always so quickly. And I know that we do experience instant manifestations. We do, if we're experiencing, a lot of fear. If I was to have an out of body experience, as an example, like let's say I've had a long day, a hard day, and I'm feeling really low. I've learned that because other states of reality, other dimensions, other realms can be very thought responsive in comparison to what we normally experience in physical reality. It's usually more subtle here. On these other levels, it's not so subtle. A thought can equal an action instantly. So if I go out of mind with if I go out of body with a poor state of mind, I can start to instantly manifest my mindset, my thoughts, my feelings. And that can quickly create a situation which might, seem very overwhelming. Whereas here in physical reality, we usually have indications that maybe we overlook because they can be more subtle. So maybe I'm in a low quality mood and I'm walking around London, and I notice that everything is frustrating me, but I don't do anything about it because I'm not really lucid enough. I'm having my in-body experience, but it's not a very conscious in-body experience in that moment. Maybe I find that every step on my path as I'm walking from point A to point B, people are constantly stepping in front of me, and I'm having to walk around people, and I find it agitating. And if I'm not doing anything in that moment to shift from that state of fear, and make no mistake, if I'm agitated, if I'm angry, if I'm feeling rage, these are iterations of fear. They're not iterations of love. It's not joy. It's, these moments are not bringing me joy. I'm repressing my joy in that moment, and I'm feeling fear. So, these are just small signs. They're opportunities. I think karma is always looking for opportunities to manifest, sort of paying back those debts. And that could be as simple as, if I'm experiencing anger, then I'm being reminded that there's a part of me that needs to work on my anger, that I have lessons around my anger. And the lessons, say, for example, if I'm getting frustrated while walking, from point A to point B, and I'm almost treating other human beings like hurdles, like this is a gauntlet that I have to navigate in order to get to where I want to go, instead of in that moment stepping back and remembering that, we're hardwired for connection, not for disconnection, but for connection, and finding a way to connect in that moment with other people. So instead of frowning, instead of getting upset, I find a way to create an instant miracle. And these miracles are, like they say in the Course of Miracles, it's a shift from fear to love. So whenever I see the signs that I'm in a fearful state, and that could be me rushing around, not taking a moment to address the situation, having these moments where I feel overwhelmed. It's in those moments where I really do have to recalibrate my nervous system. That could be as simple as taking a breath, taking a time out just for maybe 2 minutes, just stopping on the sidewalk, maybe standing on the grass, and breathing for 2 minutes while looking up into the sky. And for those 2 minutes, I'm maybe saying soothing things to myself, maybe going through positive affirmations in my mind, genuinely wanting to make that shift from fear to love. Because I think Sherry, you're right. We seem to navigate two parallel worlds simultaneously, and those parallel worlds are, one's a world of fear, and the other is a world of love. But only one of those worlds is real, and that's the world of love. And I think this is what Buddha was always talking about when, and Buddhism, has this philosophy of this reality is illusory. It's like an illusion. But I think the illusion that's being alluded to is the illusion of fear, because ultimately it's the fear that obscures the reality of love. It makes us feel that maybe in a moment when maybe a family member is angry at us, or maybe a work colleague is angry at us, in that moment, our fear is obscuring the truth that they still love us. But it's okay for people to get angry. If we do something that upsets somebody, then anger, usually is one of the mechanisms sometimes that people let us know that, we've done something to upset them. And they may not be necessarily using their anger as a weapon, because, anger in itself, there's nothing unloving or unspiritual about it. It only becomes unloving when we use our anger to attack somebody. If our anger is just being expressed in the sense of, I'm letting you know that, I'm upset, without attacking you, with my anger, then this is everyday life. So I think, when we get to a stage in our development where we can start to make these shifts more regularly throughout our daily lives, we realize that the only control that we have in a world that's outside of our control is our own self-control. And it's just something that I have to remind myself of, because I find that we really want to experience freedom. All of us want to experience freedom. We want to be able to express ourselves in our most creative, ways, to actualize our fullest potential. And a lot of the times we're not we want to experience freedom, but what we're actually experiencing is license, where we're saying and doing anything that we want, whether it hurts ourselves, whether it hurts other people. And I find that the guiding force behind license, doing whatever we feel like doing, whether it hurts us or other people, is self-hate. And I find that self-hate is creating this state to where we don't have self-control. So we don't have self-control around the choices that we're making. So if we really truly want to experience a life of freedom, it's learning that self-love is the road that we must take. It's that road that leads to being able to create the space, a choice space, a space that's a larger space, between the gap between some sort of trigger point. So if something's triggered me, if my anger, has been triggered, then if I have a very small to no choice space, because I have no self-control around my choices, because I'm operating from a place of self-hate, then you're just going to react. You're going to get triggered, and you're going to go right into some sort of dysfunctional behavior. Whereas when we really start to take that road that leads us into that parallel world of love, where we make that shift from fear to love, we start to create more choices for ourselves, because we're creating a bigger space between getting triggered and taking a moment, maybe like the classic 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, which is a mechanism just to stop ourselves. We're counting down from 10, 10, 9, 8 before we do something. And hopefully within that larger space, that larger gap, we remember to make that shift. And by doing so, we then have more choices. We realize we have more choices. So I find myself throughout my everyday life, I am navigating that dual world of fear and love. And the more I realize that, I have choices. I have more choices. I'm creating a better life for myself and creating a better life for everybody that I encounter, whether it's on a synchronicity walk or whether it's just, walking from A to B. Because if I'm attacking other people, I'm attacking myself. If I'm attacking myself, I'm attacking other people. That's just how it goes. If I'm giving fear, I'm receiving fear. If I'm giving love, I'm receiving love. And these are just things that I think everyone has experienced. But at some point, you have to take a fierce moral inventory to be able to see it straight. Sometimes we come across messages we're not ready to hear yet because we're not in the right state of mind for it. But ultimately, there's a price that we pay if we don't start to pay attention to the signs.
Yeah, and they're always there, it seems, if we're paying attention. And I think, that was just one of those things. I was sitting here and watching the chat, right? And then I'm watching Mother Nature was posing some questions. And then, I was like, okay, well, I'll ask them when, whenever you got done talking. But then you answer the question. And then I look at, okay, he answered the question just then. And I look back and she asked the follow-up question. And I'm like, okay, I'll ask him the follow-up question. And you answered it. I'm like, okay, this is weird, And then she even says, is he watching the chat? Thanks, if so. And I'm like, no.
I didn't even know there was a chat.
You're in the groove, man. You're like in the groove. You're like answering the questions. I'm like, wow, this is like on autopilot here. This is amazing synchronicity. But I could have easily not been paying attention, But I'm sitting here just watching it all it seems so orchestrated, like we were just talking about, man.
But this is cool. This is a demonstration of how, on a deeper level of reality, all minds are joined. And this is why it's so important to be mindful, of these principles. Because how can I possibly think anything, let's say, for example, about a friend. Let's say I have a negative thought about a friend. If we truly believe that we live in interconnected reality, then I'm not an island. I don't have, my island doesn't have boundary points like a large ocean, a body of water. If I think something, if I feel in a particular way, on the unconscious level of another person, they will feel it. They will receive that thought because, when you look at something like the internet is an interconnected system of devices. And I look at reality in exactly the same way. So with the internet and the interconnection of all of our computers, how do we communicate? We communicate via instant messaging and emails. And I find that when you look at interconnected reality in exactly the same way as the interconnected reality of the internet, you see exactly the same phenomena. When you look at something like telepathy or deja vu or channeling, all of that is just a sign of an interconnected reality, just like the internet. And when you might send an email out, if you've never seen email before, if you've just wandered out of the wilderness, and this is completely technology that you've never witnessed, it's going to seem magical in nature. It's going to seem mystical. And I think this is exactly what things like, telepathy that may seem mystical, ultimately it's just a sign of interconnected reality. So yes, so it makes perfect sense that those questions are being answered because our minds are joined, and especially in this moment because we're all more present. We're really tuned into one another, and the telepathy becomes a much more effortless phenomena because we are so tuned in.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I just had to say it real quick that at work this past weekend, I was just really, really, really busy and kind of overwhelmed. And what I'll do is just start appreciating the fact that it's going by quickly because I'm so busy. And I'll even notice that my patients and everything will start kind of helping me in some kind of way or whatever. And, I always claim that all of my work's protected. And, I've had so many little miracles happen that's prevented any mistakes over the years and stuff like that, because I've always worked like that. And now I'm just learning to run my life like that. Separating work and life. I mean, I'm just starting to learn to do if I would been doing my life like that the whole time, I'd have as much I don't know how to explain what I'm saying, but anyway,
I
though,
think you're doing a really good job.
Yeah,
And I
it
think,
seems to be what life's all about, is trying to, figure out that balance with everything, right?
so, and I think the balance that Sherry's alluding to is really an important. It's a gold nugget, if you like, because you're absolutely right. There's no disconnection between your work and your personal life. What takes place at work will affect other areas of your life, including your personal life, your private life, and what takes place in your private life has the potential to affect these other areas of life, including your professional life, your work life. So I think when we start to really understand the depth of these connections, it all becomes, we see the holistic nature of it, and we realize that, how do I want my private life to be affected by the things that I do in my business life? How do I want my business life to be affected by the things that I do in my private life? And this is why, when I do astral projection and lucid dreaming, my philosophy is that I do these things not to become a better lucid dreamer exclusively, but to become a better human being.
right.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that that's what a lot of, I kind of think that you don't really move on in those areas until you're really ready for, I mean, like the cosmos wants nice people roaming around and not, mean ones, if that makes any kind of sense. But
It does. It does.
what
And
I
I
was,
think, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think, the reality is that the universe doesn't just have loving growth in mind for us, but it has loving growth in mind for everyone. So, that's just what I pick up on, what you just said. And that's how I see it too, that, it's loving growth for everyone. And that includes politicians that we may not like. That includes neighbors that we might have disagreements with. It includes work colleagues that there's conflict with, or family members, loved ones. It's not just about our spiritual growth. It's about everybody's spiritual growth, and the universe underlies everyone.
Yeah.
I think going back to what you were saying just a little bit ago about not really being on our own island, that we've got this interconnectedness. And I think a lot of times when people are awakening and there's such a mismatch that happens in their relationships, either whether it's a mom and a daughter or a husband and a wife or whatever, there seems to be this, while we might not say anything out loud, there might be this sort of underlying these thought process that we're sending to this person. The old water experiment, how the water molecules are affected, or the rice experiment, where you're sending love. And you can be trying to love someone, but if your thoughts are constantly like, oh, I'm so sick of this person or whatever, you're really sending that to them like all the time,
You
And
are.
even as like a person, even if you don't feel like they're a good match for you, or if it's your mom and she's been getting on your nerves or whatever, you can still send love, just like you would any person, because everyone does, deserves love or whatever. But that can help so much in the unseen world, because now, if you can imagine that rice experiment when it looks all yucky because you've been thinking, oh, I hate you so much for a month, and now all of a sudden, you've been sending love. Even if they are getting on your nerves, you can still send that love, and it affects your outcome. It really does, and that person.
Absolutely. And I think, it's a very important insight, because I think a lot of times maybe we've been conditioned to believe that relationships are a 50-50 endeavor, that 50% of the relationship is my responsibility, 50% of the relationship is your responsibility. But I think this is a misconception, because there's always something deeper going on because of that interconnected reality. And I think when you start to view all relationships as 100% your responsibility, our responsibility, because what happens when, on a day, let's say, for example, in an intimate relationship, let's say that our partner is having a very bad day. They're not in a place to where they can take responsibility for, or that they're taking responsibility for everything that they're saying, everything that they're thinking. What happens if we play, that relationship from that perspective that rule set that, hey, wait a second here, this is only 50% my responsibility. You have to take responsibility for what you're saying right now. We've all been in a state of consciousness where we're not taking responsibility. We're in a state of denial. We're angry. Maybe we've lost something, even if it's self-confidence. If we lose something, we're going to experience some stage of grief. And if we're not taking responsibility, because we could be in denial to our own feelings, we're just intellectualizing them instead of allowing ourselves to purely feel that in that moment, or express our pain without taking it out on somebody, creating suffering, because suffering is under our control. I think pain is something that we, it's part of the human experience, and it's just everyday life. But suffering, I think that we do bring about, from self-fate, by not taking that control I was talking about, having the choices around control. And if in that moment, if we don't take 100% for the relationship when our partner is in a bad mood, then there's going to be conflict, because I think it's the Course in Miracles, which I mentioned, that mentions whoever is more sane in any given moment, then that person is the one to give love. And I think this is the principle of giving to receive. In those moments where the other person is maybe taking energy, we're around people and we might say things or think things in our mind like they're like an energy vampire. Ultimately, the person is just in a state of mind where they're taking energy, and they're not in a state to where they can give it, and maybe not even in a state where they can receive it. So they're taking it, but they're unconsciously doing so. It's not something they're consciously doing. That's just not most people's reality. In that moment, it's learning that, okay, I'm not just having my anger mirrored to me, what's inside me. This person is angry, and therefore I'm just being shown what's in me. We're not, always just being asked to be mindful of what's in us as in our darkness, but we're also being reminded to be aware of our light. And in that moment, I could be being asked to flex my spiritual muscles, to show mercy, to show understanding, to show compassion. And, when we do this, then it can have a profound effect on the outcome. It can have a profound effect on that moment. I see it every day with my wife. Both of us, we're practicing at this level. And if one of us gets triggered and we don't, if we don't do, a state breaker to stop us from going into a dysfunctional pattern, then the other one takes responsibility. The other one, instead of going into fix-it mode, and the other one, instead of elevating the situation out of control by giving anger, if you're getting anger, then giving it. We give compassion, we give kindness, we give mercy. And sometimes, because mercy is unconditional and compassion is unconditional, I think sometimes people think that, but if I show my partner, let's say, for example, forgiveness in that moment, then they'll just realize they can treat me like a doormat. No, that's not unconditional love. That's making you a doormat. It's your self-hate that's making you the doormat. I can say no if my partner is being really mean. I can say no. There's nothing unspiritual. I think sometimes people think in our spiritual communities that when we say no to them, when we set a boundary, that we're being unloving. There's nothing unloving about setting a boundary. There was actually a study that I remember reading where the people who are the most generous naturally are people who understand and know how to set boundaries and maintain boundaries. There's a researcher that I pay a lot of attention to. Her name is Brené Brown. You might have heard of her. She does a lot of research on shame and things like vulnerability. And she told a story about, I think it's every Christmas, certain relatives get an invitation for a Christmas dinner. And she said on one occasion, I think it was an uncle or somebody, but it was a family member, who got really drunk and basically was misbehaving and causing a lot of disruption at the Christmas dinner. So the next year, when it was time to send out the invites, instead of not sending the invitation, which, perhaps a lot of people can be forgiven for thinking that I need to protect myself in this way. I'm not even going to send the invite. This person's not coming. Instead, we set a boundary. Instead of excluding people, we set a boundary. And what she did was she picked up the phone, instead of even sending a note or an email, picked up the phone and said, look, I love you. And, what happened last year at the party, it was painful to experience. It was, I think we need to talk about that. And I'd like to invite you again this year. I'd like to invite you to the party. But I'm saying right now that you're not allowed to drink. If you drink, then I'm going to ask you to leave. So she just set a boundary. It didn't mean, that we have to, exclude people. And even with our spiritual growth, I think sometimes people feel that when we grow, we sometimes leave other people behind. If we're leaving other people behind, we have to look at that. And I understand that sometimes if a situation is dangerous, if a situation is even deadly, then yeah, we have to look very close at that. It's like when I have out-of-body experiences, if I'm experiencing something very dark and it feels really dangerous, sometimes the most appropriate thing for me to do is to run, self-preservation. But I think in everyday life, it's actually rare that, we're experiencing on a moment-by-moment basis something so dangerous, something so deadly. If we are, then we really have to look at our lives. We have to look at, what we're still doing, what we're still allowing to take place. But if it's one of these moments where we're just not offering forgiveness, we're just not offering our mercy, which, like I said, these are unconditional things. These are examples of unconditional love. I can be merciful in a kind way. I can reach out with unconditional love and say no, but I can say no with love. I can say no with my kindness and my compassion. And I don't always have to exclude people. I can set a boundary until that person is able to maintain that boundary themselves, until that person is able to not operate from the effect level, such as their dysfunctional patterns, their dysfunctional behaviors, but actually operate from the level of cause. And when they're able to operate from the level of cause again, then everybody will naturally be in that sort of state of balance. And boundaries won't have to be something that is discussed openly. It'll be something that you feel naturally, that, I understand where the line is. I understand where the line is between, self-love and self-hate. And then we start to operate from, this level of self-governance where you are working on that karma. You are doing your own inner work, because again, it's one of these things, and you might have find this yourself, that sometimes we come across, people who claim to be, spiritual or religious, but maybe they're not being, the light of love. And they might say something like, whenever there's any sort of conflict, oh, this is your doing, because I've done my spiritual work. When we're blaming other people, we're not operating on a spiritual path. And I think it's important for us to really understand how much this stuff matters, because people matter. We matter to other people. Our world matters. So, really being present to this reality is important.
And it does really affect us ourselves too. We just don't see the direct connection there,
For sure.
How connected we all are with one another. And if you're not treating that person well, then it's just gonna, bounce right back to you, basically.
For sure.
So I did want to circle back around to two different things: the out of body information, because you train people how to astral project and things like that. Do you want to talk about that, or because you have to have a device too, don't you? Something you invented that we can talk about a little bit? Because I think that's fascinating. You know.
And then
For
one more
sure.
thing to throw in was,
Hmm.
I wanted to ask about the meditation and like energy work being. I'd never really thought about how important probably energy work is. Also, that I had learned that from you. Also, anyway, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think the energy work, so to answer your question, Shane, I think what Sherry just pointed out is probably a key for a lot of this stuff. And what I'm really finding fascinating right now is, so over the last couple of months, I've started uploading to YouTube, to my YouTube channel, a lot of my guided astral projection meditations that I use exclusively in my workshops. And because, I don't have that opportunity to be with people face to face, other YouTubers who are listening to these meditations. I haven't had the opportunity to fully explain every nuance of these meditations. And one of the things that a lot of people are finding is tripping them up is the energy work that I have at the very beginning of these guided meditations, because they're so used to going onto YouTube and accessing guided meditations, which are all about relaxation. And sure, you can reach a very deep state of relaxation, which could then lead you down the road to an out of body experience. But typically, that would be a spontaneous out of body experience. People who come to my workshops want to be able to get to a point where they can consciously induce the out of body experience. I find that consciously induced out of body experiences require a lot of energy, chi, prana, universal energy, whatever you want to call it. It requires energy. And if our chakra system, if our meridian system is all, out of balance, if we're blocked, if we have energy blocks, then it makes it more difficult to project. So I make sure at my retreats, the prime thing that I'm teaching is energy work, because in order to produce consistent results with out of body, triggering out of body experiences, we need to have a good basis of energy. So I get comments on my YouTube videos these days of people saying, I found the breath work, too hard. The breathing is too fast. And you think about shamans as an example, or if you think about Wim Hof and the Wim Hof method, shamans usually use, breathing to induce altered states. And there's a study that was done on REM sleep, so the dream-induced stage of sleep, and they found that we have a faster breathing during the longer stages of REM sleep, which are very similar. The pattern of breathing is very similar to what you would experience if you're hyperventilating. So hyperventilation is a faster breathing, but it's an uncontrolled breathing. Whereas when you do energy work and breath work in particular, and if the breathing style requires you to increase the breath rate, so instead of maybe 15 breaths per minute, which is usually quite the normal breathing rate for most people, just for everyday living. For the study on the REM sleep, it showed that in those longer REM cycles, we increased the breathing rate up to around 30 breath cycles per minute. And it's theorized that this is actually creating certain chemical reactions within the body, within the brain, probably creating melatonin with that faster breathing style, which is potentially then being converted and into other more profound chemical reactions, maybe even what they would call the spirit molecule or DMT. So I find that when we're doing breath work, we are not just breathing air, we're not just taking in oxygen, but on a deeper level, we're actually drawing in energy. We're actually stimulating the flow of energy, and therefore we're unblocking or creating balance within our energetic system. And by doing that, we're then increasing the flow of vital life force energy which is not just being taken in by the energy body or the etheric body, which then enlivens the physical body, but there's a deeper process that's taken place with the astral body. These are just labels. Most of the labels that we use in these circles are based on the theosophical labels: astral projection, astral planes, the etheric body, but they're labels that are still very effective for us today. And you can look at any system. You can look at Hinduism, Buddhism, Zen, and you'll find different labels for these energy bodies. But effectively, most of these different, teachings promote that there do seem to be like these nested energy bodies, and those energy bodies require energy. So the energy work is profoundly important for this stuff. But getting back to some of the complaints on YouTube, so I find myself constantly now going on to field these comments and give answers to people to help them understand how vitally important it is. Even if it's not something like astral projection, if it's forgiveness work, I find that when I've recalibrated my nervous system through doing breath work, by opening up these energy channels in my energy field, I'm also at the same time I'm opening up channels in my physical body, like my brain, for example. I'm opening up to my higher reasoning centers. It gives me a better opportunity to have a clearer mind. So it does have a profound effect all around, whether it's for out-of-body work or whether it's forgiveness work. It's something that I would certainly recommend for people to look deeper into.
Excellent. So how does your machine help with these altered states, your invention?
So the machine works on the fundamental principle of the brain having what's called a frequency following response. So throughout the day, we will experience various brainwave states. When we fall asleep at night, we enter delta, which is a very slow brainwave. They suggest less than 4 hertz. That's like somebody switching on a light switch on and off 4 times per second or less for delta. And in delta, we experience things like deep sleep, rejuvenation, growth hormone. So this is why delta sleep is so important. It's important to get a certain amount of sleep. So let's say, for example, when we wake up, our primary waking consciousness is beta. Beta is like 13 hertz. That's like somebody switching on a light switch 13 times on and off per second. And it can go up to, more than 30 hertz for beta. So beta, high beta. And every state of consciousness has a brainwave. It seemingly has a brainwave associated with it. So for example, stress and anxiety, that's a high beta wave. Depression is a low delta wave. So every thought, every feeling can actually influence our brainwaves. Our behavior can influence brainwaves. So PandoraStar, which is the light device that my company manufactures, it operates on that principle of the frequency following response. So with closed eyes, people will then switch on the machine, and if they're experiencing stress or anxiety, they would put it on a setting that would bring them brainwaves into a more balanced state. It would create a more beneficial brainwave state. So the machine is used in hospitals. It's used by psychologists for doing grief work. If somebody has cancer, that can be used to relieve the stress, the anxiety, and the depression, because those have brainwaves associated with those states of consciousness. We also use the light in a more recreational way. So we have here in London what I call our mind spa. It's called Pandora Spa. And we use the light to induce, very, phenomena that you'd experience with something like LSD. So with LSD, you have beautiful kaleidoscopic colors. With some experiences, you can experience fractals. And what's taking place here on one level whether it's LSD or whether it's PandoraStar, it's creating this whole brainwave state. This is what the effect LSD has on the brain, is it literally bypasses normal communication channels. Well, PandoraStar can do a very similar thing. It can bypass normal communication channels and get more of the brain communicating simultaneously to create these altered states that can be very useful for inducing out-of-body experiences, for inducing lucid dreams. For example, we engineered the light to be able to run up to four frequencies simultaneously. And lucid dreaming is an example of that sort of hybrid state of human consciousness. It's not just one brainwave state. With lucid dreaming, it's a hybrid state of REM sleep, and it's four independent brainwaves, which are all simultaneously synchronized. And we can actually set the light to also run four frequencies simultaneously that the brain will process, because the brain is used to being able to process more than one frequency at a time. So yeah, basically we're just following that principle of the frequency following response, where the brain will tune to any external frequency or stimulus that's strong enough, and PandoraStar certainly is strong enough.
So it almost sounds like similar to like taking it to the next step past what we see with like hemisync, where you've got two different signals and it entrains the hemispheres of the brain. But now you brought in like a visual aspect of it. That does it work through audio as well as with the visual, this actual star thing we see in the picture on the website?
So PandoraStar goes and acts upon the brain, influences the brain through the visual pathway, so the optic nerve, and it will start to influence particular regions of the brain. We can probably influence around 80% of the brain through the visual pathway. With audio entrainment, such as hemisync, which is binaural sound, then it's acting upon, of course, the audio channels, and usually can stimulate certain regions of the brain, say, for example, the hippocampus. And by using light and sound, you can actually start to increase the stimulate, sort of a larger portion of brain stimulation. So we find that, both have their own independent benefits. But yeah, even maybe something like combining the technologies, then you can get a more powerful effect. And even though the ears the brain slightly processes sound faster than light, it always finds a way to synchronize that information and that data. I mean, the clear example is the sound of my voice, and you also being aware that my lips are moving when I'm talking. The brain finds a way to synchronize that data. And I think it can do the same with, if you can synchronize the sound and the light, then yeah, it becomes a more powerful effect.
That is so interesting, man. So, okay, so right now this is set up. It looks like on the website you can find a location that's in your area to find one of these spas, because it would be, of course, pretty expensive, I'm assuming, to try to put one of these in your house. But like anything at first, a 3D printer, you got to go to the guy who's got it, and that's sort of, I guess, the stages we're at right now with this thing until...
Yeah.
So are they all over the world right now? Or
I think we have around 700 lights that have been purchased. So we have a portion of owners that use the light personally, and of course, sorry, it's a very private thing for them. They don't use it with other people, but we do have locations that people have been trained to use the light commercially, and we do have a light in most countries around the world. So
nice.
In the United States, for example, I think California, just as an example, there are probably maybe 10 or more lights in California, stretching the length of the state, and throughout the United States, probably a good 100 or so lights. So plenty of locations for people to try the light out. And we have some great programs. We have a program called LSD, which basically is just paying homage to, the hallucinogenic itself, we have another program called Acid Squirrel, which is just a very creative name for a program which is very weird and wonderful. We have another program called Happy, which is all about helping people balance their brain waves if they're experiencing stress, anxiety, or depression. Just 5 minutes on a program like that can suddenly bring about a very different state of consciousness and hopefully happiness, which is, the label. But we have, I think, almost 100 programs that we've created in-house, and then we have over 100 programs that have been created by our user community. So there's a lot to explore.
Wow, this looks so awesome.
It's so weird because I had so many synchronicities with with Pandora, like this whole 2-week avatar thing I go on. But it's so weird because I've studied a lot of out-of-body authors and, just people like you and stuff. But for some reason, you're the only one that I have like these like weird dream experiences with, where I had an experience with your logo before I saw it, and where I had seen it in the dream state. And then I had this lucid dream. This was probably about a year ago, and I was at like an expo. I did not know anything about your equipment or anything. And I was at an expo, and there were like several tables, I guess like vendors of people with spiritual stuff. And you were there, and there was like it was almost like there was like a red curtain, and it was more like something that was set up to have people that they could go through and like experience what it was like to have an out-of-body experience, even though they, had never had one, maybe like a simulation of it or
That's
something
so cool.
like that. And somehow I was like involved with that, and it was just so weird because, if the exposure to your work as compared to like some other out-of-body authors and stuff like that, and like I've been to the Monroe Institute and all that, was so small for me to keep having all these little things like that. It's just really interesting to me. So
I think it shows our deeper connection. And this is one of those things. It's like when we meet a stranger and we have that sense of familiarity. I think, it's evident. I mean, here we are, we're live on a Google Hangout, and we're having a great conversation. So I think that those signs that you were experiencing were just showing, the connection that we had, and perhaps what you could say is the synchronicity between us, the resonant energy between us that was leading us, to, we were on different pathways, but it's leading us in the same direction. And so at some point our paths were bound to cross. And I think sometimes we experience that precognitive nature of reality, which again doesn't have to be mystical. It's just an interconnected reality. At some point, the opportunities are there, and these other parts of the system, such as advanced versions of us, parallel versions of us, our guides, our helpers, are laying these opportunities, are laying these, each stepping stone for us sometimes. And they can see the synchronization between our thoughts, our feelings, our work, and it only makes sense that they connect us.
It's almost like little hints to the fact that time is an illusion, as they always say. It's kind of hard to picture that, but here she's having these little visions of things beforehand, and I'm sure you've been working on it for a while, but it's just out there, these thought forms that you can pick up on, that you can dream about, or whatever affect your dreams.
Absolutely. And I think you've pointed out that, I think time, space, these are not fundamental. Consciousness is the fundamental. Mm-hmm. And like I said, with regards to, us as individuals, we're I think Marianne Williamson, or maybe it's the Course in Miracles, which would say that, we would believe on one level that we are, just separate waves in a big ocean. But when we sort of rise up from the other body of water, in that moment, it may seem like we're separate. But eventually, that swell goes down, and we can feel that interconnection again. So I think it's there's just we experience these peaks, these different moments in our life where usually when we don't feel that interconnected reality is when we're operating from a basis of fear, which is why I think it's so important, to do the recalibration exercises like meditation on a daily basis, because meditation gives you that opportunity to go deep within yourself, going deep within spiritual reality where everyone's connected, to where we can build our energy. And when we come back out of meditation, we usually then experience like we've renewed our spiritual connection. We've renewed our connection with the world, and therefore we have a better relationship with the world and everybody in the world. So I think it's important for us to get into, creating, these new habits, spiritual practices, because, spiritual life, it's an everyday thing. It's a moment by moment experience. And if we're not recalibrating our thoughts and our feelings, if we're not doing our inner work, if we're not doing the forgiveness work, the shadow work, it comes at a cost, and not just a cost to us, but our communities.
Definitely. Well, tell us how people can best get a hold of you. I do have your YouTube link below, and I've got the PandoraStar linked below. What all do you have? Do you have anything coming up, any kind of seminars or anything that you want to talk about?
Sure, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity. I would say YouTube is probably my preferred channel because there is a community aspect to YouTube. There are the comments, and then there's a community tab on every YouTube channel if it's active. So I'd love to direct people to YouTube. I also run my 9-day astral projection retreat, usually once, sometimes twice a year. So if they type in, let's say, astralprojectionacademy.com or astralprojection.com, I own that domain as well. So those are ways people can find me on Facebook just by typing in my name, and various other rabbit holes like spiritualunderground.com, where there are some exclusive videos there that can't be found on YouTube. So yeah, there's definitely places that people will find me hanging out, that they can interact.
I just want to make sure that everybody in that chat room goes and subscribes to his channel, and because just those synchronicity walk videos are just amazing.
They are, and I noticed also, Todd, on some of them, it's like, as you're going through and you're editing the footage and stuff, you notice these extra little synchronicities that you miss while you're walking through the first time. I seen like the one on the escalator number 9. I was like, so that was really cool. These little bitty things that you miss, but you get to find them later, like little, jewels or whatever. I think there was a sign on the ground on one of them.
Or something that had like 66 or 99 on it or something one time.
It's just crazy. I mean, it's crazy what we miss in everyday life. And I think that's the beautiful thing. These synchronicity walks, it's a tool for helping us see realities within realities within realities. And sometimes, because of our belief system blindness, we don't see what's right in front of us. And there are things that we miss, the signs that we miss. And this is the thing about synchronicity. It's an everyday experience. It's something that, is always on. And we only miss it because of our belief system blindness. We only miss it because maybe being in a low quality state of consciousness. So, or maybe we're just having a singular focus and sometimes we miss it. But again, that's the power of a synchronicity walk. We usually have 20 or 30 people. And so therefore we have 20 or 30 sets of eyes that will see something. But even if the group misses it, the camera very rarely does. And there are things that I never include that, there are certain things that get picked up by the camera, which may not be something that, is a great benefit to everybody. But curious to me nonetheless. And maybe it's like a personal meaning, and maybe sometimes why I wouldn't share something of a more personal nature. But I do like really putting the footage under like a microscope and seeing what's there, because like one of my favorites is the synchronicity walk that you were talking about. I think it's called Synchronicity Walkers Follow the Tesla Numbers 369. Yeah. And the first episode, part 1, No, it was actually part 2, the one you pointed out, part 2, where it shows where we go underground. We're going down into the subway here in London, and my wife walks out in front of the group for the first time in the footage, and I call her name. I say Sky, and the moment I say Sky, there's an electronic advertisement board on my left that the camera picked up. I didn't see it in the moment, but when I looked at the footage, the moment I said her name, Sky, it changed from one advert to another advert for Sky TV. And it was perfectly synchronized. I mean, it literally couldn't have been better synchronized. You can see the video on that. It is just absolute organization to the very highest level. It was just such a beautiful thing to see in the sort of post edit stage. It was just wonderful to experience.
Yeah, I totally love those. I've been getting it with music and everything, where the music's going right along with what you're saying. It's almost comical at sometimes you're like, I don't know. It's just it's there, a little wink from the the higher realms to make you laugh or whatever. Okay,
For sure.
so I've got your one web address added. What was the other one? Spirituality Underground or
spiritualunderground.com.
spiritualunderground.com. Okay, so I'll add that one too. All right, perfect. All right, so yeah, you got a lot going on here, man. And is there anyone?
Yeah.
Okay, so YouTube is the best way to probably get a hold of you, though, huh?
I think YouTube is just a great thing because a lot of times people want to make personal contact through email. But I find, although sometimes we want to protect the privacy of some of the things that we want to share and get some advice on, I think it's sometimes a loss to the greater community because what affects us as individuals is usually affecting everyone. Yeah. So I definitely encourage people to find it within themselves, to be brave, to go on to YouTube, post a comment, maybe if there's something you're struggling with or something you want to share, because, I monitor, all of the comments very closely. If somebody's being abusive, then, I'll step in. So I usually will create spaces where people can be vulnerable. I think it's important. I think vulnerability is very important for our growth. And I'm usually very active on YouTube more than anywhere else. So I will answer people's comments usually within a day.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, I find that the same thing. And then people can interact. People can see that other people are dealing with the same stuff. So, yeah, I completely get it, man. Well, Sherry,
yeah, it's important.
Else, Sherry, that you want to ask before we...
Oh, no, that's...
Or wait, did you get to mention your astral travel stuff coming up, I guess?
So I think I did mention. So I've got in August and September is the next 9-day event, and it's in France, but we make it so easy for people anywhere in the world to get to. It's in the Pyrenees Mountains, which are on the border of France and Spain. And actually, the closest and most convenient airport is Barcelona. All of the information about it's on the website, but even from the United States, it's so easy to get a flight to Barcelona. And then we have a group coach that bus that collects everybody on the same day, the arrival day, and brings them right to the retreat center. It couldn't be easier. So, at first people might think, well, it's difficult. It's Europe. It's easy to get to. It's just one of those things where we're usually in our comfort zones. It's usually the fear. So it's just, if we really want something, if something really matters, then we find a way. It's just like, the philosopher in Jurassic Park, the first Jurassic Park, life finds a way. So do we.
Yeah. I got to get Gosha from Cosmic Agency. She's in Barcelona. Were you thinking that too?
When she said Barcelona, I was gonna be like, shout out to our girl.
Yeah, send her over there. She can get you on her channel too, because she's got a huge following over there. So that'd be perfect. Yeah.
That would be a pleasure.
Well, awesome, man. Well, we'd love to have you back sometime. It was a real wonderful pleasure to have you on, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks for coming on. I'm so excited. This is great.
My pleasure, Sherry. Thank you so much for getting in touch and for inviting me on. I'm really thankful, and it's been fun.
Yeah. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you guys in the chat. Lots of love to everybody watching now and later, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace.
Night.
If you'd like to support the work I do, go to paypal.me/UOTF. Thanks.